There is a question that history rarely asks out loud. How did an entire family survive a winter night so cold that a single hour of exposure could quietly end a life before the sun ever rose? Not trained soldiers, not modern survival experts with insulated gear and satellite maps, but ordinary people, children too young to understand the danger, elders whose bodies no longer held heat the way they once did, hunters and mothers carrying water through the dark, fathers repairing a roof, while snow buried the world around them. For thousands of years, across the frozen edges of Europe, Siberia, Greenland, and North America, these were the people who faced the cold, and somehow, against everything working to erase them, most of them lived. But to understand how, you first have to understand what winter truly was, because it was never simply a season. It was not just snow and shortened days. Winter was a system of pressure, a slow and patient force that reshaped every single hour of human life. Food vanished beneath the ice, rivers hardened into walls, and daylight shrank until whole communities lived by firelight alone. And here is the part almost no one expects. Some of the shelters these people built were so effective that they held heat better than poorly insulated cabins standing today. No engines, no electricity, no blueprints, and yet a warmth that modern comfort still struggles to match. Because the true enemy was never the cold itself. The cold does not kill all at once. It works quietly, dismantling one system after another. A weak fire leads to exhaustion. Exhaustion leads to mistakes. Mistakes waste the calories a body can no longer spare, until the smallest failure becomes the final one. The real battle was never human against winter. It was human against collapse. And hidden inside that battle was a single decision, repeated every night, that quietly separated the living from the dead. It was not the fire. It was not the furs. It was not the walls. And by the end of this story, you will understand exactly what it was. To understand that decision, you have to understand how quietly the cold actually kills. It almost never arrives as a dramatic, violent death. It begins with something as small as numb fingers, then reactions that slow without the person noticing, then a strange confusion that softens judgment, then a heaviness so complete that movement itself begins to feel optional. And at the very end comes a kind of sleep, warm and peaceful and false, the kind a person never wakes from. This was the pattern that repeated across the frozen north for thousands of years, and it explains why a thin, hastily built shelter was often a slow death sentence. Its walls leaked warmth into the freezing air, every escape degree demanded more wood, and every branch dragged through deep snow burned calories that winter made almost impossible to replace. A body running that kind of deficit weakens, and a weakened body works slower, and slow work in the heart of winter is how people disappeared. So the people of the North discovered something that feels almost counterintuitive today. Survival was not found in isolation. It was found in closeness. Inside those tightly sealed winter dwellings, entire families and often several generations pressed together through the long dark months. And in doing so, they turned their own bodies into a source of heat. Because a single resting adult radiates roughly the warmth of a small heater, and a dozen bodies in one enclosed space could lift the temperature of a room without burning a single extra log. Shared walls meant less exposed surface. Shared fire meant less fuel spent per person. Shared labor meant no single body carried the full weight of survival. The shelter itself became something almost alive, a living machine powered not by fuel, but by cooperation. And there was an intimacy in this that our modern world has almost entirely forgotten. Strangers to loneliness, they slept shoulder to shoulder in the dark, breathing the same smoke-thickened air, listening to the coughs of the old and the quiet stirring of the young. And always, without needing to be told, the children were kept nearest to the warmest heart of the fire. It was survival, but it was also belonging. Yet the very warmth their gathered bodies created was about to give rise to an invisible enemy, one capable of destroying the shelter slowly, from the inside out. That enemy was not the cold pressing against the walls, it was moisture. Every breath released a little water into the air. Every pair of boots carried snow indoors. Every pot set over the fire lifted vapor into the room, and every patch of melting ice soaked slowly into the floor. And once that dampness settled into an enclosed winter space, it was brutally hard to drive out. This is something modern survival experts still warn about, because moisture is often more dangerous than cold itself. It quietly destroys the one thing standing between a body and death: insulation. Damp furs stop holding warmth. Wet bedding pulls heat straight out of the skin. Water rots wood, weakens roofs, and invites the kind of slow decay that no fire alone can undo. The people of the North understood this danger long before anyone gave it a name, and so they fought it with a patience that looks almost like engineering. They learned to open small vents that could be widened or sealed as the weather shifted, to hang hides that broke the drafts, to pack moss into the walls where it drank the moisture from the air, and to raise their sleeping platforms above the damp and freezing ground, letting the warmest air rise to meet them while the wet air was carried upward and out through the smoke. And at the center of it all was the fire, which was never only a source of heat. The fire was order itself. It set the rhythm of when to cook, when to sleep, when to mend a torn hide, or shape a new tool. When the flames were strong, life moved with purpose, and when they weakened, everything slowed with them. The shadows lengthened, the cold crept inward, and breath began to hang visible in the darkening air. Which is why these people almost never let a fire simply burn. A roaring flame devoured fuel and filled the room with smoke, so instead they mastered something far more disciplined: a low, slow burn that gave the most warmth for the least wood. Hardwood embers glowed through the night beneath a protective blanket of ash, holding their heat long after the last flame had died, so that the morning fire could be coaxed back to life from the surviving coals rather than built again from nothing. There was something deeply human in those final hours of a dying fire, when the light shrank to a handful of orange embers and the whole family drew closer, watching their own breath turn to mist inside their home, trusting that the heartbeat of coals beneath the ash would carry them into another morning. But warmth and moisture were not the only forces pressing on that fragile shelter. Because soon the winter would send down a threat that no fire could ever hope to solve, and it would fall silently from the sky itself. Snow looks soft from a distance, weightless, almost gentle as it drifts down through the dark, but the people of the North knew the truth hidden inside that softness. Wet snow, piling hour after hour across a roof, can gather into a weight of hundreds of pounds, and under the pressure of a long storm, an entire shelter could groan, buckle, and collapse onto the very family sleeping beneath it. This single danger forced them to rethink the shape of the buildings themselves. A flat roof failed too easily, holding the snow like a shelf until it broke, and so across the forests of the North people turned toward the curve. They bent young saplings while the wood was still green and flexible, shaping arches that could flex under a burden instead of snapping beneath it, roofs that guided the crushing weight downward and out into the ground rather than letting it pool at a single breaking point. And those same rounded forms carried a second gift, because when the storms came screaming across open land, the wind slid around a curved shelter far more smoothly than it ever could against a flat wall, sparing the structure and sealing out the cold at the same time. But the most remarkable discovery was stranger still, almost poetic in its reversal. The very snow that could crush a home could also be made to save it. Packed against the outer walls, snow became a blanket of insulation, because trapped inside it were countless tiny pockets of air that slowed the escape of heat. And so these people learned to turn the environment against itself, letting the same force that killed exposed travelers become the shield that protected the ones inside. And here is where the story becomes almost haunting. This same wisdom appeared again and again, in places that had never touched, never traded, never shared a single word. The turf houses of Scandinavia, the snow shelters of the Inuit, the sunken pit dwellings of Siberia, different peoples, different centuries, different materials, all arriving at the same quiet answers. It is a strange and beautiful thing to imagine that a family in the frozen forests of Siberia and a family on the ice of the far north, separated by half a world and thousands of years, were solving the very same problem with the very same mind. Because the laws of heat and cold do not bend for language or belief, physics does not care about culture. It rewards only those who learn to adapt. And everywhere that human beings faced the deep cold, they were quietly pushed toward the same handful of truths. But survival in the deep cold was never only a battle of walls and fire. It was also a battle fought inside the mind. Months of confinement in a single dim room, while the storms erased the world outside, and the darkness stretched longer than the light, could unravel a person as surely as the frost. And so these people discovered that the mind, too, needed shelter. Routine became a kind of medicine, the same tasks in the same order, day after day, giving shape to hours that would otherwise dissolve into a grey and endless sameness. Stories told around the fire were not idle entertainment. They carried memory, identity, and the hard-won lessons of those who had survived the winters before, passed down so that no knowledge died with the elder who held it. And the children learned not from lectures but from watching how to tend the embers, how to read the smoke, how to feel a change in the wind, absorbing survival itself through repetition, until it lived in their hands. Yet for all of this, the shelter remained fragile. A single ember left unwatched, a single roof beam giving way under the snow, and everything could be lost in minutes. That is why they could never survive alone. Their safety was never one person's strength, it was the many, watching over one another through the long dark. And when spring finally returned, when the ice cracked and the rivers moved again and the shelters slowly emptied, the buildings themselves were left behind, but the knowledge was not. Every repaired roof, every improved entrance, every better-placed sleeping platform was a lesson written directly into the architecture, a physical record of everything one more winter had taught. And now, at last, we can return to the question we began with, that single decision, repeated every night, that quietly separated the living from the dead. It was not the fire, it was not the furs. It was not the walls, it was the choice to depend on one another, to hold to discipline when comfort begged them to stop, to keep watch while others slept. The cold could be met, but only together. That was the decision, made every single night, for thousands of years. Comfort, it turns out, has always been fragile. Systems are what endure. And survival, in the end, was never about strength. It was about discipline, adaptation, and the quiet courage to face the dark as one. If stories like this move you, the forgotten engineering and hidden endurance of the ancient world, then stay with us and subscribe, because here, history is not a myth. It is the story of how human beings refused to disappear,